truly understand that you are my only stability. I know I've heard you say, do not be afraid. Put your trust in me, and I'll increase your faith. The answers may be unclear, but I'll rest in knowing you are near amidst the unclear. Help this heart to truly know that I am found in you alone. No matter what this life has in store, we will walk together, I as your child, and you as my Lord. I know I've heard you say, do not be afraid. Come put your trust in me, and I'll increase your faith. The answers may be unclear, but I'll rest in knowing you are near. Blessed are those who do not see and yet believe. Blessed are those who do not see and yet believe. Give to us this kind of childlike faith. Give to us this kind of childlike faith. I know I've heard you say, do not be afraid. Come put your trust in me, and I'll increase your faith. The answers may be unclear, but I'll rest in knowing you are near. The answers may be unclear, but I'll rest in knowing you are near. Amidst the unclear.
I had never heard that song before, and so first service, after Lindsay sang it, I asked Brendan, where did you pull that song from? It is so perfect for this morning. And he informs me, Lindsay actually wrote that song. So Lindsay, thank you so much for sharing from your heart this morning. In just a moment, we're going to take a look at the life of Thomas, and I can just imagine Thomas saying a lot of the same things that we just heard a moment ago. My name is Chris Conway. I'm the middle school pastor here at Rose Drive Friends Church. I absolutely love working with middle schoolers. I do, however, have a little bit of a sadistic side. There's part of me that likes to ask them questions that I know they can't answer. And so one of my favorites right now, it seems like it should be a basic question, but nonetheless, you get these incredibly perplexed looks, is simply, why are you a Christian? And you say that question, and it's like they know they should have an answer, but they've got nothing. They don't know what to say. The funny thing is, though, I ask the same question to adults, and I get the same perplexed look. It's almost identical. Basic question, why are you a Christian? Why am I a Christian? What in our lives has gotten us to the point where we're able and willing to say that we want to follow Jesus Christ, acknowledge Him as the Lord of our lives? There's a lot that goes on in believing and in faith. And sometimes we just don't understand the whole picture. For a lot of my life, I could not see very well. Somewhere around 5th grade, my vision started to deteriorate a little bit. I needed glasses, contact lenses. If I would wake up in the morning and be able to see the alarm clock across the room, I knew I was in trouble because I left my contacts in. It was going to be an unpleasant morning. So finally, the optometrist gave me the go-ahead. My eyes had stopped changing enough that I could get laser eye surgery. And I was really excited for laser eye surgery. The surgery itself kind of scared me a little bit. I mean, this whole idea that you cut into an eye and burn away stuff and it makes you better still doesn't make sense to me, but there it is. So I'm really hoping to get 20/20 vision out of this process. They can't promise you that. They say that sometimes the variables that are part of it, I mean, you might get 20/25, 20/30, but 20/20, perfect vision was my hope. If I could get that, I just would totally feel like it was all absolutely worth it. And so I go in, they do the surgery, it's about a day's recovery before I'm able to go before the optometrist, and I kind of pull the patches off my eyes, and he's looking at it, and he looks like it's a good job, and so we take the eye exam test, and this is where I'm going to see, do I now have 20/20 vision? So I see the chart in front of me, and I'm just nailing line after line after line. I get to the bottom, the 20/20 line, and yes, without any difficulty whatsoever, I can read the whole line. I have absolutely perfect vision. I'm really excited about that, but the optometrist just kind of chuckles a little bit, and he goes over to the chart and does something I could never have expected him to do. I didn't even know it was possible. He takes the chart, and he flips it over. On the other side are another series of lines, smaller yet from the 20/20 vision. I had no idea even existed in an eye exam. There was something far better than 20/20, and I had no idea. My definition of perfect vision was completely flawed, in part because there really is no such thing. And so I start to go through this second chart, and I nail the first line, have a little bit of trouble with the second. On the third, I have to give up. Turns out, though, I have 20/10 vision with both my eyes working together. My definition of perfection didn't make sense. And in many ways, as we approach the subject of faith together, we kind of need to be willing to flip over the eye chart. See, we're willing to acknowledge that faith is something worthwhile, but it's a journey that never ends. A journey that demands all of who we are. Ultimately, Christianity is a little bit of a scandal because it asks us for two things that are just really difficult at times to do. And the first is how we act, how we interact with the world around us. The things that we do, kind of the externals of faith in many ways. But even harder than that, Christian faith compels us to address and change what we believe. Our very beliefs are called out and challenged and told to be made new. And for many of us, this is just such an incredibly difficult calling. To this world around us, it seems so impossible, even offensive. How can we begin to have faith? It demands that we evaluate what we believe. Well, today we're going to look at the story of Thomas. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to John chapter 20. We're going to look at that story today. We've been, for the last couple weeks after Easter, going through some of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus in this series that we've called Risen, Now Expect, and then we fill in the blank. And this week our blank is faith. Christ is risen, and now we can expect faith. So go ahead and turn to John chapter 20. We're going to start at verse 24. We're going to begin to read the story of this man, Thomas. It goes like this. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my fingers where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your fingers here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." We just heard those words a moment ago in the song. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Thomas. We've come to know him as Doubting Thomas. This is the phrase in the popular Christian world that we ascribe to Thomas. This moment when Thomas had such a specific request from Jesus. He had such specific needs that had to be met before he was willing to believe. And from these commands, essentially, that Thomas gives, this is where we get the idea that Thomas was a man of little faith. That Thomas was a doubter, one who couldn't see the whole picture. That all evidence to the contrary was refusing to believe in Jesus until his arbitrary demands were met. This morning, we're going to look at this idea of faith and belief and how these two work together. But one thing that you need to know is that belief is a theme that goes all throughout the New Testament. It shows up in the book of John in several places. In John chapter 4, there's a royal official who is absolutely desperate to have his son healed. And he comes to Jesus saying, "Jesus, heal my son." And Jesus knows, actually, this man doesn't believe a thing about who Jesus is. He's so desperate, he's willing to try anything. And Jesus knows, if I heal this man's son, then he will believe me. But there's something about that he doesn't quite like, and so he calls it out. And Jesus says, this generation, you need signs and you need miracles before you believe. Kind of the same thing that Thomas is doing in this passage. Later on, in other parts of the New Testament, after Jesus has been resurrected, people begin to see and experience Jesus. In Matthew 28, the disciples and a bunch of other people make it to Galilee where he's there, about to ascend to heaven. And they see before them the risen Lord. Everything seems to begin to make sense to a lot of them, and they worship. But in verse 17, it says that some of the people who were right there seeing the risen Jesus, they doubted in that moment. And then we have this story of Jesus appearing to his disciples, showing them his wounds so that they would stop doubting. We see it in Luke, and we see it in John. Now, this is key to remember. If you have your Bibles open or whatever you're using for a Bible at the moment, go back a couple verses before verse 24. You're going to see almost the exact same story. It's going to be some kind of major deja vu moment for you, because you get almost the exact same story twice. Thomas is the second one. Just before that, all of the disciples, except for Thomas, had also experienced Jesus coming into a room and showing his hands and his side. In many ways, Thomas was simply asking for the same thing the other disciples had already experienced. This man that we know so much for his doubt really was just looking for the same thing that his friends had. There were some obstacles in his path, some blocks that existed. But to call Thomas a doubter is to isolate him into this one period of time that doesn't make sense, because his story ultimately really is a story of faith. And so here's how we're going to go about the rest of the morning here. We're going to look at all the instances in which Thomas speaks in the book of John. There's only 3 total. Won't take us forever, I promise. But we're going to look at all the times that he spoke. And what we're going to start to see is this picture that John paints of Thomas, where Thomas is moving progressively toward new faith. That all along the way, he's seeing more and more on the eye chart. New things are available to him as he seeks Christ with everything that he has. So go ahead and turn to John chapter 11. John chapter 11 is kind of in the middle of the gospel. This is kind of a critical moment. So here's what's happening. Jesus had just escaped Judea with his life. A lot of people were hearing the things that he was teaching, seeing the signs and the miracles he was performing, and they didn't like it. They were afraid of what it might mean. And so they actually tried to kill him. And Jesus and his disciples had to flee to avoid being captured and possibly killed. And so they've just left Judea when they get word that their friend Lazarus is really sick, probably about to die. And Jesus is the only one who can do anything about it. Now, Jesus has a plan in mind for how he wants this to go, but he does intend to go back to where Lazarus is, and the disciples just can't begin to imagine why he would ever take such a risk. And they tell him outright, "Did you forget? We were just in Judea. They tried to stone you. If we go back, they're going to do the same thing. You cannot go to Judea." But Jesus was insistent on this point, that he visit Lazarus, who was dead, but was going to be risen through Jesus, through the power of God. The disciples, they couldn't understand it, and honestly, neither could Thomas. That was beyond what he understood of the world. People don't rise from the dead. There was no good reason for Jesus to go into Judea. But Thomas, more than anything else, was loyal to his Lord. So if you look at verse 16, he says to the rest of the disciples, and this kind of closes the matter, let us also go so that we might die with him. Thomas, in this statement, shows a loyalty that is probably beyond his understanding and his faith. And there turns out to be a lot of truth in what he said, but it was almost a truth spoken in ignorance, because Thomas could not begin to understand everything that Jesus was about to do. But he had a relationship with Jesus. He trusted Jesus and was willing to do even the ridiculous for his master. In many ways, in this passage, we begin to understand that this man that we call the doubter understood loyalty in a way that I can't even begin to fathom. Sometimes this aspect of the Christian faith may actually be some of the easiest, because we know that in following Jesus, we're asked to do some things. Some of these might be disciplines, things that we know that help us draw closer to God, things like reading the Bible and praying and coming to church on a Sunday. These are fantastic things that allow us to draw closer to God. Sometimes we do them even past where our faith would suggest that we would do them. I was actually just at a graduation on Friday with one of my friends, and there was a rabbi who was giving the invocation. And he begins to pray, and as he's praying, I begin to pray with him. Now, if you'd sit us next to each other and have a theological debate, we're going to have some significant differences, all right? But in that moment, this rabbi and I both had something in common. We had in common the relationship with the people in the room, the desire that my friend would go on to do great things, the desire that as people, and a lot of things that he was saying were spot on, incredible ideas for how we as people could just continue to treat each other better. I was all for that. And despite our differences, I found myself in agreement with someone I don't share a faith with. Sometimes we do things outside of our faith because of a relationship that we have. In many ways, this is Thomas's story. He has a relationship with Jesus, he just doesn't understand it yet, but he's willing to move forward. And in this, I see a disciple who's so loyal and willing. But this will take us to our next story. So in chapter 14, we begin to see rational Thomas, all right? I really appreciate this aspect of Thomas's character because this is pretty much how I function in almost everything. He is extremely concrete. He likes all of the dots to be able to connect. He likes A to go to B, to go to C, to go to D. He doesn't want to jump anywhere in there. He is someone who has thought through things well and is looking for very logical, conclusive answers. And so in John chapter 14, Jesus is beginning to tell his disciples that he is going ahead of them to his Father's house and will prepare there for them a room. And the disciples don't really understand anything he's talking about. Thomas is the one who speaks up, because Jesus had just said, "You know the way." And Thomas is trying to do some mental calculations. Has he ever told us this before? Has he told us the route? Where is he going? I don't know where he's going. So he asked Jesus point blank, "Lord, how can we know the way if we don't know where you're going?" It's like Thomas wanted Jesus to pull out a map, put it on the table, and draw it out for them. Go around the mountains over here, avoid Samaria, get back to Galilee, something, I don't know. Something to where Thomas could get his mind around a very linear path to the thing that Jesus was saying. And this question, which was very honest but also highly ignorant, gave Jesus the opportunity to speak some incredible truth, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, that no one will come to the Father except through him. But this challenge to believe such a statement was more than Thomas could wrap his mind around at the moment. That would require him to completely change the way he views the world. His very mechanical, rational, concrete view of the world would have to expand to something entirely different if this was true. I just don't think he was there quite yet. It's also true for many of us. I did speech and debate in high school, and so what would often happen is I would find myself in a debate that I actually disagreed with what I was arguing about. But speech and debate rule number one is it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong. You always claim that you're right because everything in the tournament hinges on whether or not you are right. I do remember one particular debate where we were debating the use of the penny in the United States currency. I was arguing that we needed to keep the penny. It was part of our tradition, and my opponent was giving what turned out to be some really good reasons for why the penny is absolutely pointless in our world now. And I realized halfway through the debate, I agreed with the other guy. And to this day, I still will tell you, we need to get rid of the penny, but that's another debate for another time. But here I am in the debate. I cannot change my position. I absolutely must stick with what I've said I believed all the way through. But that's so true of us in every other aspect of our lives. Our beliefs very quickly become part of our identity. We present to others who we are based on the kinds of things that we believe about God, about the world, about science and technology, the things that we hold to. And the deepest part of ourselves become our identity. And so it's no wonder then that when we're asked to put our beliefs on the table, to reevaluate them, that it almost feels like a personal insult. It's like someone is telling us to take the essence of who we are and is just molding it into something different. And that is not a pleasant experience. But here it is. Jesus, he's teaching the disciples and he's telling them your worldview isn't enough. It can't contain the kinds of things that I'm talking about. I need you to put your beliefs out on the table and to rethink some of this. And in that process, there's going to be uncertainty. There's going to be questions. There's even going to be doubt. But we've come to realize that these things are actually very helpful. They're actually very human. Because if we didn't have questions, if we didn't have doubts, if we didn't have uncertainty about God, it would mean one of two things, both of which I can't accept. One is that I am incredibly awesome and in control of this universe. And I hope for your sakes that's not true. The other is that our God is so small that we could figure him out. That we could connect all the dots for who God is and turn him into a nice, pretty math equation. I don't like either of those. I don't believe either is true. Our God is bigger than we can imagine, and so it only makes sense that when we come to the table with what we believe, that we hold them out in submission, because we are finite. We are not the end of the story. And God can take those who are willing to put everything on the table and do something incredible. And this is where we see Thomas go from someone who doubted to someone who is full of faith. So let's return to our story, this faithful Thomas. In chapter 20, we begin to understand that Thomas, as soon as he saw Jesus, everything changed. Jesus, he comes to him and he says, look, he doesn't even say hi. He already knows what Thomas needed. He's like, Thomas, go ahead. Put your fingers through my hands, put your hand in my side, do the whole bit. Stop doubting and believe. And we don't know if Thomas took him up on his offer. It doesn't say. Maybe in kind of almost a trance. He might have just kind of done those things like, is this really happening? I don't know. But it's also very possible that in that moment, seeing Jesus was all he needed. See, for Thomas, in this moment, seeing the resurrected Lord in front of him, there existed this incredible life and death paradox that he previously had no box for. The idea of resurrection, the idea of Jesus being Lord and changing everything, was more than he previously could have understood. He needed a new eye chart. He needed someone to flip it over and say, there is more to this faith than you ever dreamed possible. You have not reached an ounce of perfection. You were on a journey toward the God who is risen. And Thomas, he begins wrestling with his doubts and his questions and his rationality and his desire to have all the dots connect. And they aren't connecting yet, but in front of him is life and death beaten. And in that moment, he chooses what is most true. And he is the only character in the Gospel of John, besides the narrator who told us this right at the beginning of the book, he's the only character in the Gospel of John to declare Jesus not only as his Lord, but as his God. the only one who was able to fully articulate that the thing he saw in front of him was nothing less than the creator of all the universe, the creator of Thomas, the Lord of life and death, the one who would make all things new. From Thomas, we learn that faith is a process. Faith isn't something that necessarily just happens in a moment. Now, certainly, there are mile markers along the way that we can look back to. But throughout all of our lives, God is going to be consistently challenging the things that we do and the things that we believe. And it should always be so. Because it's in those honest and ignorant questions that we give God the opportunity to show us things we never could have dreamed were possible. A lot of us, this was certainly true of Thomas, sometimes come to the table with a little bit of a conditional faith. I mean, Thomas, he had heard Jesus' teachings before. He heard the testimony of the woman who saw the resurrected Jesus. He heard the testimony of the disciples who saw the resurrected Jesus. And it wasn't enough. Thomas had this very specific criteria that had to be met for him. If that wasn't met, well, then faith wasn't possible. Sometimes in our lives, we do the same thing. We give God these specific things that he has to meet before we're going to say, okay, I believe. But God is doing so much more in this world than simply choosing our arbitrary demands for how he wants to prove himself to us. God is working in such a way that he's drawing us to himself and to a faith that doesn't eliminate questions, but shows us which questions are important. A faith that takes our doubts and our uncertainties and absorbs it and says, these things don't matter. There's something more important out there. And that's the kind of faith that is hard, takes time, takes nothing less than an act of God, but brings us to a place where our faith isn't conditional. Our faith becomes the lens through which we view all of the world. And so now, when we ask ourselves the questions, why are we Christians? Why am I a Christian? I hope that 10 years from now, I don't answer that question the same way I do today. 20 years from now, I don't answer the same way I do 10. That I will always be moving with God toward a process of a new eye chart, of seeing more clearly the things that he is doing in this world. And allowing those questions to be part of the process. Sometimes as Christians we get the idea, and I think the rest of the world sometimes thinks this, that when you come to church you leave your brain at the door. May that not be true of us. Let us be people who ask good questions, the important questions, people who are willing to wrestle with God so that he can show us more than we ever understood before. Let us be people who follow the example of Thomas and walking on this faith journey, moving toward not an end, but a relationship with Jesus that is ever growing. Let us be people that in community help each other grow, not being afraid to ask each other questions that sometimes seem difficult, being willing to wrestle with each other toward greater understanding as a community about what God is doing in this world. Let's be a people together who, with Thomas, can boldly declare in faith, my Lord and my God. Let's pray.